Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to our last message of a series we're calling How to Be Rich. And as my mother mentioned, that not all of us enjoy this topic, talking about money. We're wrestling with, in this series, wrestling with the tension, the reality, our current reality, that we are rich. By world standards, we are rich. Now, you may not feel rich, but when the poorest 5% of America is wealthier and better off than 2/3 of the rest of the world, pretty much everyone in America is rich. Now, you may not feel rich, like I said, but that's probably because you have very little to no margin, or maybe even what we would call negative margin, because more is going out than is coming in. And you don't feel rich because everything that comes in goes out and you tend to get behind. We encourage that you get within your means and get actually below that so that you have extra, so that you feel rich, because the reality is that you are rich and you need to feel responsible for being rich. So we're wrestling with that reality and trying to answer that question, what then does God expect us to do with the wealth that we have? What are we supposed to do with that? How do we carry out the responsibility that we have? And I hope that this message series has impacted you as much as it has impacted me as I've prepared it, as you have heard it. I hope it impacts you for the remainder of your days, but in particular, as we approach our holiday season. Because when we get into the holidays, we often think of giving, and it's a good time to give, but often people overspend and get out of and kind of use up their margin on things that probably shouldn't be used on. So I'm hoping that this kind of engages us to think about our extra, think about our wealth differently, especially as we approach this holiday season and give where there's a greater impact. Next week, we're going to be starting a 2-week series on Thanksgiving, with Thanksgiving coming, and I'm calling it Gratitude Fatigue. Have you ever just kind of felt like, I'm tired of being thankful? I don't know if there's much to be thankful for. And you kind of just, everything seems to be bad news. And it's just tough to be thankful. And maybe it's just kind of something in the past or something old, but why does Paul say, give thanks in every circumstance? That's what we're going to try to tackle over the next 2 weeks as we enter the Thanksgiving season, and then we'll move on and into Advent. But today we're going to take communion together. I didn't get it in the bulletin. I'm sorry. It's been in the bulletin for the last few weeks, but I try and I still make mistakes. How many of you can identify with that? Okay. So I'm not alone in there. It didn't make it in the bulletin, but we are going to have communion together. We are going to collect an offering, a second offering, a special, pretty much, we only do this one time a year, unless there's other needs that need to be taken care of. But we're going to collect an offering for our Alms Benevolence Fund, a fund that gives confidentially to some of the needs that are within our own community and possibly within the Akron Newstead community that we become aware of. It's called the Alms Benevolence or Alms Elder Fund. We're going to take a collection for that at the end of our service. And then after that, the end of our service, we're going to enjoy a potluck dinner together. We're going to enjoy some fellowship together because we enjoy eating together, we enjoy fellowshipping together. So if you forgot that it was potluck or you're new here today, we want you to join us for a meal because we'd like to get to know you better, we'd like to get to know each other, and so we invite you to do that. But before all that, we're going to finish up this series with a message. We're going to talk about a financial concept that probably is responsible for more generosity than any other financial concept. This idea has released more giving. It has instigated more philanthropy over the years than probably any other idea. It's probably the main reason that religious people, particularly those who call themselves Christian, that they give more than non-Christian or non-faith people do. It's a principle that I believe that you can take to the bank. So I'm calling this last message in this series of How to Be Rich, Take It to the Bank. Are you ready? All right, let's go. Pull out your papers here in your bulletin. You have a fill in there. Even if you're not going to fill them in, it has the scripture right on there, or you're welcome to turn to chapter 6 of 1 Timothy. That's where we have been. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 to 19. And we've already looked at the in the series that we've been in, we've looked at the first two verses that Paul wrote to Timothy, and he's telling them, giving Timothy a specific message for the rich. And when I talked in the first message that some of us, and many of us kind of look at that and are like, well, I'm not rich, so that doesn't apply to me. Well, it applies to us, and we've been trying to apply it to us. Paul's telling Timothy, tell the rich these things. And he actually tips his hand right in the beginning here to where he's going to land this section and talk about this financial concept that is so important. And he does that right in the first few words of the instructions. So there in verse 17, we have the whole passage there, right on your message notes. It says, command those who are rich in this present world. It's right there. Did you see it? You see it? Underline the words present world. Command those who are rich in the present world. Like, if you're thinking about it, you're actively reading, you're thinking, is there a non-present world? Is there some other world? Is there a future world? Why doesn't he just say, command those who are rich? He says, command those who are rich in this present world. So right here in the beginning, he tips his hand to where he's going with this passage. He says then, in this present world, not to be arrogant. We talked about arrogance and the tendency that rich people have towards that. And to not put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain. We talked about the migration of hope, how our hope migrates from the one who provides the wealth actually to the provision of wealth. And Paul's saying, don't let that happen. Don't let your wealth become where you pin your hope, because it's so uncertain. But rather, put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. And you remember, we made that declaration together, I will not put my hope in riches, but in Him who richly provides. That's a game changer. Like, if you don't remember anything else from all 4 weeks of this series, I hope you can remember at least part of that declaration. Because if you can begin to adopt that declaration, at least even in part in your life, it can change your life. I will not put my hope in riches. Who would put their hope in riches? It's so uncertain. I mean, it makes sense. And yet, that's what we end up doing. So if you can even get a part of that, digest it into yourself through this series, I think it'll change your life. So he says then, command them to do good. We talked about that last week. Command them to do good. Not just good, but to do extra good. To be rich in good deeds. And to be generous and willing to share. Willing to give more. Willing to be in relationship with, communicate with. We talked about the nuances of that word share. And then here in verse 19, he picks this up. And he says, in this way, in what way? In the way of doing good, in the way of being generous, in the way of being willing to share. In this way, your hope won't migrate. And in this way, something tremendous is going to happen. When you live this way, when you think this way about your wealth, something tremendous is going to happen. It says, in this way, keeping this lifestyle, in this way, you will lay up treasure. They will lay up treasure for themselves. Now, when you're, again, if you're thinking about this reading, and maybe, probably very few of you are reading it for the first time, but if you're thinking about it, it's like, well, if you're laying up treasure, how does that work? When you give something away, usually you have less, right? When you give it away, you have less. But Paul's saying here, when you give, when you're generous, you're actually laying up treasure. So he's telling the rich, give, be generous, be willing to share, and in that way you're going to lay up treasure. It's sort of counterintuitive. It's kind of upside down, tipping it on its head. And then the other thought is, why would they need more treasure? I mean, rich people have treasure. Why would they need more treasure? Well, Paul is getting at something that's very significant. Here he says, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age. There's an age coming. There's a future that's coming. That's not this present world. That's different than this present world. Now, we go about our lives most days, I hate to admit it, not really thinking about that coming age. We think mostly about the present world. But Paul is saying those who know how to be rich are thinking about the coming age. They're giving, they're generous, they're willing to share, and thus they are laying up treasure for themselves in the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. So the first fill in there, and it's pretty basic, but there's more to this life than this life. That's the financial concept. That's pretty significant. Very significant. There's more to this life. There's more to the wealth that you have right now than there is right now. There's a later. There's more to this life than this life. You know, it sounds kind of mystical, and but most people, over 80% of Americans, at least in this country, over 80% believe in some kind of afterlife, that there's life beyond this. So it may seem mystical, but really it's kind of intuitive. There's a sense that we get that that there's something else coming, that there's another life coming. And instead of making some other reality up, that what future life is going to be, whether you're like reincarnation or whatever, I'd rather trust what God says about this coming life and adjust my life now so that I'm more prepared for what's really life ahead. So it makes intuitive sense, really, that there's a life coming after this life. Rich people have more opportunity in this life. Rich people have more wealth and therefore more opportunity in this life. And this life, in this present world, Paul's saying, is a test. A test of what we'll do with those opportunities. What will we do with those opportunities? And we think of a test now probably in ways that, like, if you've ever heard it on the radio or on this TV station, this is a test of the emergency broadcast system. This is only a test, right? Or we think of a test in school that if you do poorly, then maybe you can retake the test. That's not this kind of test. This is not only a test. This is life. This is our test. Once you've lived a portion of life, now I'm not saying that God doesn't allow do-overs, because He gives us second, third, fourth, fifth, and sometimes 156th chances at kind of rebooting and forgiving, right? I'm not saying that He doesn't do that. But once you've lived a section of your life, you know you can't go back and live it again. Once you have an opportunity to do what God has called you to do with the wealth and resources that He has given you, and you neglect to do it, you don't get that opportunity again. Do you hear me? You know what I'm saying? You can't live it over again. You can't push the rewind in our age of DVR. We can't rewind it and play it again. We have opportunities, and this is a test that we can't just ignore, because our life in this present world is not all that there is. We're being tested, and those who have extra, and I would argue that we all have extra or should have extra, and can work to have that extra wealth, have extra responsibility. So why were we all, most of us anyway, born in America? Why were we born here? Why were we born into the families? Why do we have the jobs that we do? Why do we have the privilege and the wealth that we do? I'm not quite sure why. But I'm asking what I think is a better question. What then does God expect me to do with what I have? Instead of trying to figure out why am I privileged to be born here in America, in a developed world, and have an income that I have, instead of trying to figure out why I'm so blessed, I'm trying to ask the question, what do I do? What do I do with what God has given me? How do I take responsibility with my position, with my time, with my talents, with my wealth, and with my opportunities? I don't want your hope to migrate. I don't want my hope to migrate from the God who has provided these things for me to the actual provision. I don't want that to happen for me. I don't want that to happen for you. I don't want any of us to fail this test. Rather, I want us to pass with flying colors. And you know, Jesus wanted his disciples. Jesus wants us to pass with flying colors. And so he tells us a story. He tells us a story in Luke. And Luke records the story. And what happened was he was a part of a crowd. You know, crowds just seemed to gather around Jesus. And there was an argument that broke out over somebody's inheritance, and they were kind of being greedy, and you can kind of imagine that situation. The same thing happens here in our days. When money comes into play, boy, it really sometimes brings out the worst in people. And that was kind of what was happening. And so they said to Jesus, you know, solve this for us. And in Jesus' ingenious way, he tells them a story to teach them what's going on. Teach them this basic principle, essentially. He tells them this parable, and parables are stories of earthly things that have heavenly meanings. They're sort of allegorical. Usually a parable has somebody representing God and somebody representing who the audience who's hearing the parable that would relate to them. And when we hear this, we should hear this for ourselves. That audience would be us. So in Luke chapter 12, you're welcome to turn there. We're going to have some of it on the screen for you to pay attention to. He begins the story, and he says, the ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. Okay? Now, he says a lot. He's really, you know, he's a great storyteller. He says a lot in like one word, because we get this picture now of this rich man that just got richer. Right? He's a rich man already, and he had a good crop. I mean, it was a really good crop. It's like if a businessman purchases a company, and 2 months later that company goes public, and the stock shares are worth so much, and he's worth so much more money than he knows what to do with. A rich man got a lot richer. That's what this story, that's the main character of the story. And that's what he's saying there. So a rich man, his ground produced a good crop. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. And you're thinking to yourself, oh, this poor fellow, right? He's got all this grain, so much, and he doesn't have anywhere to put it. Poor old pitiful me, huh? Right? No, you're not thinking that, right? You're thinking the same thing that you would think when somebody who's already rich wins the lottery or has their company go public, right? You're kind of like, yeah, you got some problems. Maybe I kind of wish I had those problems, right? Anybody, just if they were honest, say there's a slight bit of envy there, I wouldn't mind trying that problem out, right? But he's got a problem, but he's a smart guy, right? Because people who are rich are smart, and as they get richer, they get smarter, right? No. Okay, we talked about that earlier in the series, so they tend to think they do. And even some of us around them kind of placate to that because we think they're smarter because they're richer. And if if they're richer, they must be smarter. But he's a smart guy anyway, and he's going to solve this problem. So he says, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. I'll build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to myself, self, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. You have extra. You have extra. You have plenty of things, good things laid up for many years. It gives you the picture of how much wealth he actually has, right? He's got a lot of grain. For many years, take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. That sounds a little bit like the American idea of retirement. I don't necessarily want to go there. This is tough enough as it is. I'm not retirement age, and I don't know what it's like to be there yet. But it sounds an awful lot like that typical American concept of what we shoot for in retirement. The idea, the thought process was, I'll save it now and consume it later. Right? I'll save it now and consume it later. And if this was the end of the story, you'd say this is a great story about savings. Right? It's a good idea to save because you'll need it in the future. Right? The Bible in the Old Testament teaches those principles. It's wise for a man or a woman to save for the future. Right? And if this was the end of the story, it'd be like, man, good job. You know, you saved up, you solved the problem, you just built bigger barns so you can have more, so you can consume it the rest of your life. You might use it for your children, you know. This is a lesson in saving. If, and that's a big if, that were the end of the story. But it's not. See, the rich man made an assumption that many rich people make when they don't know how to be rich. He made the assumption that everything that comes through my hands is for my consumption. He made the assumption, it's called the assumption of consumption. And I'm saying don't be duped by that assumption. Don't be duped by the assumption of consumption. He assumed that whatever comes through my hands, whatever is grown on my land, and I think, you know, I'm blessed by it, it must be for me. So I'm going to save it now and consume it later throughout all those years. Don't be duped by the assumption of consumption. So at this point, Jesus' audience may very well have thought that the story was over. The rich man had a problem, right? And he solved that problem by saving. Because their understanding of material wealth had a spiritual level to it. Like, oh, you were blessed by God because your crops produced a lot of grain, so you must be blessed by God, and therefore you should save it. God's pleased with you. And if your crops fail, then God must be upset at you. Or if you're healthy and strong, then God is pleased with you and has blessed you. If you're sick or something's wrong, then God must curse you. See, they had that in their mind, so as they're listening to this story, they may very well have thought that's the end of the story. You know, like, this guy was just blessed, and that's what God does, is he just blesses more. The rich get richer, you know? That was the way they would have thought about it. They very well might have thought that this story was over. But something probably in Jesus' body language or in his look in his eye said that the story's not quite over. And they lean in a little bit, like, is there more? Is this really the end of the story? Maybe there's something else. I imagine his body language told him that there was. So Jesus continues the story of this imaginary rich man, right? This really didn't happen. This is a story Jesus is telling to prove this one point. This imaginary man's talking to himself. But then, God says to him, "You fool." And I can imagine that everybody that was gathered around did this collectively. Because they thought this guy was a hero. And Jesus just dropped the F word on him. The F-bomb, right? That fool in that day, I mean, that's a strong, strong word. We don't like to hear that other word. I don't think they were even remotely thinking that this is what would have happened in this story. I mean, it just, whoa. This guy had lots and he was blessed, and now God's calling him a fool? That's a very strong word to call somebody who has been blessed in such a way. But God says to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" But he's got lots of wealth. Doesn't that mean he's got lots of years? I mean, he's got well stored up for a lot of years. Isn't there a correlation between wealth and years? You know, I got lots of wealth, so I should have a lot of time. Right? I can't be out of money. Look at all the checks I've got. Right? There's some correlation, at least that was in his mind. But God says, "You fool, your life's going to be demanded from you." And now what? Now who's going to get the wealth stored up for you? Jesus applies this simple story for the audience in this. He says, "This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself but is not rich toward God." And that phrase, "rich toward God," is what should grab our attention. It's not that this guy it was wrong that he had the wealth, but he stored it up and he was only rich toward himself. He wasn't rich toward God. What does this word, what does this phrase, what does it mean then to be rich toward God? If I have wealth, what does it mean to be rich toward God? We store up treasure in heaven by giving wealth away, not by leaving it behind. Right? We store it up by giving it away, giving our wealth away, not by leaving it behind. We don't get credit in heaven for what we leave, because everyone leaves the same amount. All. Right? Everyone leaves the same amount. Everybody leaves all of it. The scripture that was read in the first opening from 1 Timothy as well. We don't come in with it, and we can't take it out of here. We leave it all behind. We don't get credit for what we leave behind. We get credit for what we store up or we lay up in heaven by what we give away. Now, some of you are probably saying, "Well, I don't want credit. I don't want, treasure in heaven." Well, you have to take that up with Jesus, because he's the one that developed the economy. He knows he's describing God's economy that's very starkly different to our economy. So if you're thinking, I don't want to get any credit, I don't want to lay up treasures, we'll take that up with him, because he's the one that's saying that's what we do. It's when we give our wealth away. So while we're on this earth, we have wealth, and we have the opportunity to be rich toward God. But once our life in this present world is over, so is our opportunity. You understand? Our life here, when it's over, means our opportunity to be rich toward God is over. This is where we get to do it. Now, when we think about our wealth, and we think about this as an opportunity to give away, as opposed to an obligation, that's another game changer. That's a completely different story. When it's our privilege, it's our opportunity to be rich toward God now in this present world, so that we can lay up treasure in heaven, whatever that ends up meaning. Maybe we have just more to cast at Jesus' feet because we're worth nothing, and he's worth everything compared to what we would have. I don't know how that'll all work. But we have the opportunity. It's not an obligation. It's a different way of looking at your wealth. And Jesus actually goes on to define, later in this chapter, as he's talking to his disciples, define what this word rich, these words rich toward God actually mean. In verse 33, he says, sell your possessions and give to the poor. Now, he's obviously not saying sell everything. I mean, we think about that other story where he told the guy, sell all your possessions and give to the poor. But right here, he's saying what being rich toward God means is sell your possessions and give to the poor. Not all of them, but your extra. Use your extra. Remember I said think about your extra differently. Think differently about your extra. God has a heart for his children, and particularly the poor. And you want to do something good for God? You want to be rich toward God? Don't bring your riches and plump them right up here as if you're like putting them, before the temple of God. You want to do something good for God? Do something for his children. Right? I mean, we understand that. Right? You want to bless me? Do something good for my kids. When you do something good for my kids, that's a blessing for me. I'm blessed by that. That's what he's saying. Be rich toward God, because God's children, many are in need. And when you're rich towards God, you give to that need. If you want to be rich toward God, then do something good for those who are created in his image. And so he goes on there in verse 34. He says, provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out. Now, I mean, purses in that day applied to male and female, right? I mean, okay, just so we know that. You could put in there, guys, if you want to say wallets or whatever, satchels. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Let's say that together. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. See, when we know how to be rich, you become generous and willing to share. You do more good with the opportunities that you've been given. And as you do this, you loosen your grip on your wealth. And it loosens its grip on you. When you adopt this lifestyle, when you move in that direction of being rich toward God, you lose your grip on your wealth. And it loses its grip on you. Because I think we all understand how money can get a grip on us. The number one contender for our hearts in this present world is our wealth. And we need to be watchful of that, so that we can take hold of what is really life. The life where in this life we get to make the investment into what really is life, or eternal life. Let me close with a story here. A man found himself trudging one day through a stark, bone-dry desert in the blazing sun. And as he walked for hours and hours on end, he became parched and dehydrated because of the blistering sun and unrelenting heat. Miles and miles of sand offered no moisture for him, and as he crested each dune, hoping to see even a tiny puddle of water, the desert only offered him more dry sand, more blazing sun to deal with. And finally, after miles and miles of a miserable journey, he was about to drop and give up, but he crested a dune and saw a most blessed sight. A few feet away, stuck in the middle of the sand, was an old-fashioned, hand-operated water pump. As he staggered over to the old rusty pump with its long metal handle, curving spout, he noticed that a message was stuck to it. He reached up and removed the withered paper message that had been browned by years in the hot sun and read it. It said this: "If you are reading this, I assume that you are interested in obtaining water from this pump. At the moment, the pump is not primed and will yield no water to you no matter how hard you pump.
But do not fret. If you follow my exact instructions, and trust me, you will obtain an endless supply of water that will fill you until you can drink no more. Please take note of the following, the note continued. If you dig directly down at the base of the pump in front of you, you will find a pint of water in a glass bottle. Do not drink this water. It'd be tempting. Do not drink this water, the note said. You must use every drop of this water to prime the pump. Once you have dug up the bottle, remove the cork and pour exactly half of the water over the leather seal that connects the pump handle to the stem of the spout. Currently, the seal will not work because the hot sun has dried it out. And once it's wet again, it will swell and will retain its seal. It will take exactly half of the water from the bottle to be poured on the leather seal for it to swell enough to work again. Next, pour the rest of the water down the front of the spout of the pump to prime the pipe to the underground well. This will provide the proper suction and will begin the process of drawing water once you start pumping. Again, do not drink this water in the bottle, but use it for this process. Once the water begins to flow again, drink until your heart is content. Then, refill the bottle and bury it back in the sand for the next person to use when their time comes and they are thirsty. Do not be tempted to drink the limited amount of water in the bottle and exclude yourself and everyone else from the endless supply of water that could be yours if you follow these directions. Trust me, the letter said. What would you do? I hope you would follow the instructions. God said in His Word, don't merely listen to the Word, but do what it says. Now, we've already talked about how much of what kind of giver God is. God is not a reluctant giver. God is a generous giver. And He has given us a greater gift than we could have ever imagined. He has made a greater sacrifice that is beyond what we could think of. He has given us His own Son. He's given us His Son that we may be reconciled to Him. Now, when you think about a table, and we're thinking about tables as we think about holidays and we think about getting a table ready, a meal ready to serve, who do you usually invite? Family, friends, enemies? No. You don't often think to invite the enemy. But do you realize that we were all enemies of God? Because of our sin, we were enemies of God. But what we once were, we are no longer. Praise God. Yeah. Jesus invited us. Though we were enemies, though we were sinners, He died for us and He invited us to His table. And so we're going to come now, figuratively, to His table and take communion together. Because Jesus said, I want you to recognize that this is for you. Jesus didn't come for Himself. Jesus came for you and I. That we could have life that is really life. Not just in this present world. He came that we would have an abundant life. So as we come to the table and we prepare ourselves, I hope that you have been thinking about this. I hope that because we've put it in the announcements well ahead, that you said, we're coming today to take communion together. I don't want to miss it. I know a dear friend of ours couldn't be here today because of she couldn't get a ride here. It doesn't work out. But she wanted to be here to take communion. But Cora, she just couldn't be here. She wanted to be here to take communion with all of you. because you're her brothers and sisters in Christ. Did you come expecting that, hoping, like, I want to take communion with my brothers and sisters? I hope you've been prepared for that. You're going to have a moment to do that here as we hand out the elements. We're going to play some music. It has some very powerful words. I invite you to listen to the words and just turn your heart towards God. But the other aspect of communion, taking communion, is not just for ourselves. It is for our relationship with God as we reflect on our own sin and that we were once enemies, but we're brought near now to Him. Is that we are part of a church body. And that if we have unreconciled relationships with one another, before we take communion, I believe Jesus would want us to try to make those relationships right. And so in this time that we are handing out the elements and the music is playing, if you have something that's on your heart and the person that an unreconciled relationship is in this room, I will just wait for you to go make it right. At least begin the process. And if there's an unreconciled relationship that you have with someone that's not here today, I invite you, there's little pads of paper in the pew. I would write their name down for yourself and commit yourself to make it right. If we just go on and on with those unreconciled relationships, just saying, oh yeah, I'm going to take communion, and Lord, I thank you for your sacrifice, and I'm glad we're reconciled together, but I don't really care about this other person and being reconciled with them. We are a liar. I'm just pointing it out. We lie when we say, I love God, and yet I hate my brother, or I hate my sister. We need to take care of that. We need to take this seriously. So in these moments, as we're handing out the communion elements, I just encourage you to do what is necessary. And when we're all served, and when the music fades, and if reconciliation is taking place, and we'll wait for that, then we'll take all the elements together. They will be in sealed containers together, and I'll give you instructions about how to open each of them as we go through. So those that are helping me, assisting me, handing out the elements, I would ask that you would come forward. We'll pray, and then we'll hand out the elements and take this time for reflection. So come on forward. God, as we come before your table, recognizing that we were once far apart from you, and yet you invited us here, we feel privileged that we get to take of your body and your blood represented here by a small wafer and some juice. But it's more than that. It's more than that. It represents something more than that for us. And I pray, God, that in this moment you would make it more than that. More than that for us as individuals in our relationship with you, and more than that for our congregation here at Center-Akron. That we would be so committed to be reconciled to one another as a reflection of our reconciliation with you, that it would be salt, it would be light in our community. We can only do that through the sacrifice of your Son, Jesus.